another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friends, Charles.
Yes, we say friends today because we have a very special guest. Dylan, would you do us the honors of welcoming our special guest today?
Sure, we've got Gabriela Houston on. Gabriela Houston is a London-based author who was born and raised in Poland. She's the author of the upcoming novel, The Bone Roots, which will be published on October 10th, 2023. We were lucky enough to have received ARCs of this novel from the wonderful folks over at Angry Robot Books. Gabriela has also authored several previous novels, including Slavic fantasy novel, The Second Bell, as well as two middle grade novels, The Wind Child and The Storm Child. Her work is heavily influenced by her Slavic background, especially mythologies and fairy tales from that culture, and that's wholly evident in The Bone Roots, which we are excited to talk about today. Welcome to Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast, Gabriela.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, the pleasure's all ours. We were big fans of The Bone Roots. Congratulations on the upcoming release. I think this will come out before the book is released, but only a few days before. As of recording, it's only like a week and a half, 2 weeks away, right? It's coming out on the 10th, so that's it's coming fast. How you feeling?
Yes, it is. I don't know when it happened. It felt like it was months away, and now it's coming. So yeah, I mean, it's really exciting. It's just, once this review starts sort of coming in and, when you see people's reactions, that's really amazing. And I've gotten quite a few reviews where I apparently made people cry, and it makes you, part of you feels a bit like a sadist, but then I'm just like, yeah, I mean, that's what I was aiming for. So that's good.
I feel like it's gotten to the point now where that's considered like the highest compliment for most readers is when they're saying that a book made them cry. There's like the classic Rebecca Kwong tells them to get their bucket of tears ready. So if you're getting folks to bring out the bucket of tears, and maybe they haven't since they read The Poppy War, then I think you're doing a great job of it.
I mean, it is because it's when people actually feel the story deeply and kind of acts on an emotional level, that is really what you're aiming for. Mm-hmm. So if they just read a story and they're like, yeah, it's just another story, then that means you didn't do your job.
For sure. I mean, getting people to cry with the words that you wrote, I take that as a very high compliment. That's a hard skill for sure. Yeah. And I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I have a special connection with it now because a few weeks ago I was actually just trapped in an airport in Boston for like 9 hours, and I'd already started this book, but for pretty much, I'd say 8 of those 9 hours was spent. Thank goodness I had this in my luggage with me, and it got me through some tough times. I'm sure authors hear that a lot too. So
that's a nice story. Not the 9 hours at the airport, but
yes, I was trapped, and I was like, oh my gosh, thank goodness I have this. And I just, I read the whole. I was ahead of our reading schedule at that point. I'm like, oh my gosh, the interview's not for another, week or two, but I'm already done because I was trapped. So yeah, thank you for that experience. It was very nice to be able to do that. I was crying for a host of reasons, but we'll say that the gripping story was part of it. That was the good crying.
I'll take it.
So yeah, let's jump right into the book because I think what's interesting, at least to us, about The Bone Roots, which again is coming out on October 10th, is that the work is heavily influenced by your Slavic culture, mythology, folk tales. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about, this isn't your first time writing a book using those kind of your Polish influences. So I was kind of wondering if you could tell us, what is it about, Polish folklore that kind of influenced your story writing, and what can fans expect to see in The Bone Roots?
I mean, something that I've been sort of thinking about a lot when I was writing The Bone Roots is because I'm very much interested in world mythologies, and I grew up reading different mythologies, and when you sort of go deep enough and read different versions of the same stories, which obviously happens over time, stories change. When you start to notice the really, the really important aspect of folklore in general, of mythologies and folklore, is the community building aspect of it, and the fact that it sort of serves as a guide to the rules and the values of a society that you live in. And you can glean quite a lot about the people that tell the stories, really. And so what interested me, so the Bone Roots is heavily influenced with the sort of values of a kind of pre-Christian Slavic tales. I mean, insofar as I could actually get to them, because it's quite difficult. You have to kind of compare different stories, and because the Christian influence on Slavic folklore is very distinct. Like, so for example, when you have a story about a hero empathizing with some kind of forest creature, and they band together to protect, the community, and they have this adventure, and then at the end of the story, it says, but unfortunately, after Mihao died, he went to hell, because you should never make any kind of agreement with demons and evil spirits. And it's so funny sometimes, because you can really see it sort of just tacked on the end. But when you read the sort of a lot of ancient sort of Slavic stories, the values that really shine through is like kind of ability to empathize, and also the understanding of the need for respect for the creatures of the other world. Like a lot of the Slavic folkloric creatures, they're not evil, they're not good, they're sort of just ambivalent towards humankind, and they have their own sphere of influence, they have their own sort of creatures to protect, and they're just not very interested in us unless we come into their territory and break the rules, right? So this need for respect and this understanding that the world around us is not there to serve us necessarily, right? So we have to interact coming from that base level of mutual respect, and understanding that I am here on your terms as well.
Yeah,
so
oh, go ahead.
Sorry. No, so I'm saying, so in a lot of the creatures, so the Bone Roots is really heavy on the different kinds of Slavic creatures. I went like all in on the different rituals and all kinds of things like that. Whereas the second bell was much more loosely inspired by Slavic mythology. But with this one, I used a lot of creatures that have that very kind of ambivalent attitude towards mankind, and it can be used in your favor, basically, if you know what you're doing.
Yeah, that definitely shines through in this novel. I was thinking those kind of themes come up for sure in like A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, and I was thinking when I was reading this, like the balance with nature and the ways that interfering with that balance can have negative consequences, and that's, as I was thinking, that's a good one to say. If you're a big fan of Wizard of Earthsea, then The Bone Roots is an awesome recommendation there for those same kind of themes. And so you spoke also of the idea of empathy and the central role of empathy in it sounds like both folklore and of course in The Bone Roots. And I was thinking, so this book, it's primarily about two very strong-willed mothers. It's Vedma Kada and also Sladyana Kada. That's kind of, from what I can gather in this glossary in the back of the book, it's translates loosely to like witch or even hag. So that's her role. She communicates with nature and has this kind of mystical place, but also has this more, I guess, like typical earthly place, and just like helping deliver babies and being kind of a doctor-like figure in the town. And then you have a noblewoman in Slagiana who's lost her daughter, and Kata's daughter is actually plucked from this childbearing tree, and it's really interesting. Of course, that's the childbearing tree and taking your kid from it that comes up in all those themes we were talking about around interfering with nature, but also I think empathy. It's so interesting to make, like, Charles and I, obviously not mothers ourselves, we however had a really easy time connecting with this theme of motherhood in the books, and I think that's what's really amazing about what you've done here with this theme of motherhood is it's something that we all can relate to, even though we might not have that personal experience. So motherhood, something you've explored before in The Second Bell, I believe. So a strong
and the
theme
Wind
throughout.
Child too. I can't get away from it.
So what is it? What draws you toward examining this
What is it about
theme
the whole
in your
motherhood
work?
thing?
So, yeah.
I mean, the thing is that, like, motherhood has sort of traditionally, the way it's portrayed in fantasy books, it's quite one-dimensional. So women in sort of more classical fantasy books have very narrow roles. So you can be the love interest, right? The young maiden, and the hope of, like, winning this young maiden is what propels the hero onward. There's the mother, who is usually absent or dead,
Right.
Right.
where are all the mothers in Hobbit? It's or you can be a crone. So if you don't actually accept your role, if you don't step away from limelight, then you can be the evil, either sort of fairy tale stepmother or the antagonist, like Morgan Le Fay kind of situation. So I think that it's important. Like, motherhood, it's such a, I mean, it's such a profound experience in life, however you experience it. And I think it's interesting to show how different women become different types of mothers, and how they, not all of them necessarily are suited to the experience. Not all of them want the experience, like all of this so much. And it's something that, completely changes your life. It changes your body. It's, it affects you, like, even if you don't end up bringing up your child, it affects you for the rest of your life because of how it affects your body. And I think there's just so many dimensions to motherhood that are underrepresented. Like, I'm interested in older women. So I write a lot of protagonists that are older women. So both Kada and Sladiana are in their kind of mid to late 40s. And they have not given up an ounce of their, sexual agency, of their, perhaps political ambition, in broadly speaking. So that is something that's very important to me to sort of explore. And, people talk about representation. I mean, that's important to me, but it's important to me to sort of that we think about it in different ways. And I think that there's such a wealth of human experience that, it deserves its time in the spotlight.
For sure. Yeah, it's
sure.
interesting because we see a lot in, like, modern fantasy, especially in the past, like, 10 years, where there's such a resurgence in, like, okay, how can we tell stories from new perspectives, unique voices? How can we bring more attention to that? And I think, the world of fantasy and the fantastical is such a great sandbox to put the lens of other cultures and experiences and identities into the storytelling. And I think that's something that's really interestingly done in the Bone Roots, because you take, like, I would say the two big lenses and voices, motherhood and also this Slavic folklore, and bringing them together, because you had mentioned, oh yeah, a lot of, these monsters, like, as long as there's this level of respect and playing by the rules and this and that. And then you introduce, to Kata, this element of motherhood. She has a child that she's trying to protect. So when you have to respect these monsters and creatures and things like that, but you also have to, be compelled to, protect your child, or however you interpret protecting your child, it's kind of this breeding ground for conflict and for problems. And we certainly know Kata's no stranger to that. Absolutely. So kind of messing around with these ancient, rituals and rules around how you enter a creature's area and how you talk to them, how you make deals with them, this and that. It all kind of gets brought up through this idea of motherhood, and then the creatures themselves have these interesting relationships. Some of them have relationships with their mothers as well. So that to me is the most interesting part. And I was wondering, how when you get the inspiration to bring in a lot of these creatures, and that's one of the things that I thought was another really shining moment, was all the creatures you brought in. What was the process like for, I guess, the editing process for, okay, here's the actual folklore creature, here's the creature in the Bone Roots? What was some of that process like, bringing monsters into the world of the Bone Roots?
I mean, obviously it's not an academic text, so
right.
I see it as more of a kind of traditional role of storyteller, when all of those traditions were oral traditions, people would retell the story and add a little bit of, onto it, to maybe reflect the current sort of situation or the situation of their community. And I think I see my role as similar to that. I'm not here to sort of painstakingly gather the anthropological, and linguistic information to present it in a, scientific text. So a lot of it is, inspiration. A couple of times I kind of took a creature that is quite one-dimensional and I sort of added something onto it a little bit. From a different creature, not necessarily in the Bone Roots, but in the Wind Child, there was one little creature that I basically just put together a few things.
Sure.
And sometimes it can be tricky because people are generally in the English-speaking world are not very familiar with Slavic mythology. And so sometimes they take everything at face value and they think this is the real mythology of this land far away. And it's I was quoted once on someone's I don't remember if it was blog post or if it was just simply a social media post. I don't remember. But anyway, they quoted me on Zorias, which are the three goddesses Zorias from Slavic mythology, representing morning, noon, and night. And they quoted me from the Wind Child on it, and I was just sitting there embarrassed slightly because there's actually only two, and I kind of just messed around with it from to fit my story. So
that's
I'm trying. So there's a glossary at the end of the Bone Roots where I'm honest, because there's I think a couple of creatures that I just straight up made up. So and I'm clean about that.
Right. Yeah. You interestingly were able to interject. I'm looking through the glossary right now, but you were interjecting some personality to and it was kind of pretty much made up by the characters on this one, in the definition. I'm oh, it's kind of fun. The idea of taking the glossary and using it as a way to interject some personality.
Offers note. Yeah. I mean, it's, when it comes to the actual research, I have an obscene number of books on the subject. I have not necessarily read them cover to cover, but took more of a magpie approach. I have a few bestiaries. They're in Polish, so unfortunately I can't recommend them to the English-speaking audience. But they're a great source of information because they kind of have all those different creatures, and it's just this wealth of source material that I can then infuse my story with. And there's, all those different spheres of life to this, ancient Slavic people. And it's interesting to play with the kind of borders and like how the different creatures from the spirit world sort of cross over to the other side. So
yeah, it's interesting because the only real like education I've ever had on like Polish folklore mythology is through The Witcher, of course, and played a lot of those video games, read all the books, of course, Andrzej Sapkowski. I feel like it's very American of me to be like, oh, you two, you must be friends, right? You know each other? Both
hang out all the time.
Yeah, you must hang out all the time.
I'm very happy to ride the wave of The Witcher popularity. If it's going to,
right, but
push the book into more
interesting,
hands,
right? Because something about the bestiary of Polish folklore is just ripe for all these really interesting kind of encounters in a fantasy setting. Geralt is fighting strigas and all these other endless name of creatures
in the second bell.
Yes, yes,
I do, and I play with a kind of more. So there's different versions of the striga myth. And I'm playing with a slightly kinder one, and right. Sort of subverting it a little bit, because in a lot of folklore is just straight up monsters, whereas in the second bell I was playing with that notion.
Right, but it's very interesting how a lot of these creatures, and again, this is all my understandings through fantasy retellings, but it's like we've always enjoyed talking about how we had this whole conversation about what makes a monster, and I'm sure a lot of it was intentional, like with its inspiration in folklore of like how these creatures are made. You have creatures, ghosts of children, right? And they're able to kind of get involved in the story in their own way. And it makes it that much richer in terms of like, you can kind of build the world that you're in. Some of these characters had relationships with people just in the village and things like that. And it's an interesting kind of foundation for storytelling in a way that you don't really get from reading stories rooted in very European kind of characters and things like that. So I've always just been particularly fascinated.
It is
by
European.
Polish creatures.
Western European.
The Western European. Thank you. Yes. This again, my American is showing.
I think you mean like more Anglo-Saxon.
Yes,
it's just they have different. Those societies have different values. They have very different. They had different way of life, and so but the stories reflect that as well. And in one of the sort of comparisons I like to draw sometimes is when you look at like Norse mythologies and like Norse gods, and the kind of behaviors that get rewarded in the Norse mythologies, like the tricksters, sort of. Obviously Loki ends very badly, but through most of the mythology, like he gets away with literal murder, right?
Right.
But by being a trickster, and things like betraying trust are not, the Asgard gods betray their friends, they betray their hosts all the time, they murder their hosts or try to attack them, all of those things completely unacceptable in Slavic folklore. Basically the tricksters are never rewarded. You try to not break the rules to favor you, it's not going to end well, right? You break the rule of hospitality, like you'll get eaten by mice, literally. It's that kind of so those values don't necessarily always cross. We think of those values as being quite universal, and they're really not. So depending on how the community is built and what keeps it together, those things will sort of shine through.
Yeah, For sure. That's funny you bring up Loki because we just read a book not too long ago that was called Loki by Melvin Burgess, and we had him on, and he was a fantastic guest to interview. But yeah, I feel like Loki has really become the most glamorized Norse god, and he's just an awful
I mean,
person.
he's awful. Like, what does it say about us that we find him so appealing? And I was reading this article recently. My friend sent me about the halo effect in fiction, and how the most obvious thing is like beauty bias, like when someone is attractive, you automatically assume that they have all those other wonderful qualities. And there's certain qualities about a person or about a character or about God that make us like them in spite of all the evidence pointing towards them being absolutely horrible. And like, I think Loki is such an interesting example because this is exactly what we're witnessing. He betrays everybody who ever cared for him. He does awful things, but he's quite witty. Obviously in the actual Norse mythology, like this is not what we would consider wit, right? Necessarily. Cutting off a woman's hair while she's sleeping is not the pinnacle of humor, but it's it's whatever appealed at the time.
Just blatantly breaking the rules and having fun with it, I guess, can be appealing for a lot of people. The idea that someone like that can be out there and get away with it and be a god at the same time is something about that's very intriguing, I suppose.
It's something I actually played with quite a lot in Bone Roots, but specifically beauty bias, because not to give sort of too much away, there's characters that at first glance are quite unappealing, and then they will sort of grow to be, possibly the most, definitely my agent's favorite character.
Interesting.
Falls into that category. And then you have people who are very attractive, and it takes us a while to see maybe the ugly side as well.
For sure. And you also play things with classism too. Like sometimes you can perceive people who are at the highest, running the show, right? That there may be something unlikable about someone like that. But, you kind of play with those relationships too of just because I'm the king doesn't mean that I'm think I'm necessarily better than anybody else, or just because I'm a noble person doesn't mean I'm going to underestimate someone of a lower class. Things like that as well come into play, which I find very interesting.
Or more from the other side, just because you think I have nothing, and so therefore I am nothing. But it's people finding their dignity, and people finding their self-respect, and how others react to it is of interest to me as well.
Yeah, you definitely you play with people's expectations for sure by presenting, and again, I don't want to spoil anything because we want folks to go read this, and it's not even out yet. But it's you play with people's expectations by presenting a character a certain way or packaging them a certain way in terms of their physical appearance or how you might interpret them if you had a first impression or whatever, and then they'll do something that you'll just be like, oh, whoa, I did not see that coming from this person. There's one part in particular that does that for me. I was like, oh, we're reading maybe a different book than I thought here. So I really appreciate
there's this hilarious book on writing that I read years ago. It's called How Not to Write a Novel. And it is so funny. It's basically written by a couple sort of publishing professionals who say, we don't pretend we know how to write a novel, but we can definitely tell you what
we'll publish.
What will make it unpublishable. So they go through a lot of common sort of issues in fiction writing. and they write their own exaggerated examples, and it's really, really hilarious. But there was one chapter in there where they said, where it said that basically like Santa Claus cannot be the love interest in your book. Like it can't be the main love interest. It can't, like so you see it in a lot of like, when parody kind of accounts where people repost bits of like, and I apologize because I'm speaking to two men, but it's like women described by men badly,
right?
And it's really funny, and you get like those the main character, who is clearly the author's self-insert, is like this very unattractive older man, and this beautiful model, with smiling boobs. just sort of, I don't know. I read one of those. Like,
it's fun. It's like, oh, she sighs bosomly, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
Or like some authors were like, and then she puts her arms under her breasts and folds them, and she gets mad, and you're like, what kind of detail is that?
Literally, there's like bits where like the breasts smile, and it's just like they have their own agency all of a sudden, But anyway, and then suddenly, in this most sort of unbelievable manner, this character that has nothing to recommend him becomes the main love interest for this beautiful, attractive young woman. And so there was this chapter on Santa Claus can't be the love interest, and I was thinking like, well, he can be to Mrs. Santa Claus, and it's a sort of a kind of, in a very bizarre sort of way, these kind of things stay with you, and you're thinking like, yeah, but what? Maybe he has other things to recommend him,
It's like, okay, we write A Court of Thorns and Roses, but it's Mrs. Claus as it's 20-something meeting Santa Claus.
I mean, but isn't it tiresome sometimes to read a book after book of hot 19, 20-year-olds? Like, for sure. And it's like a universe filled with very, very attractive 19-year-olds. And you're just like, there's the rest of us here, on our varying stages of life and decrepitude that, we wish we were represented in some manner. So,
For sure. Yeah, we'll age her up for sure. Maybe modern day, and they're just trying to like rediscover the passion, when you're as immortal as Mr. and Mrs. Claus, you got to find ways to spice it up every once in a while, I'm sure.
I mean, human and Santa Claus experience is endless source of inspiration.
100%. We'll break some rules, maybe. It's a funny one. I never thought of Santa Claus that way. I'm kind of adjusting now.
Let it sink in.
Yes. One of the other things about this book, and I guess this goes back to my like 8-hour binge of it, a large portion of it, was the pacing of it, right? Because as much as it is like, rooted in a lot of this folklore and this and that, it's told in a very like almost, I'll say, modern. It's kind of almost like a suspense thriller kind of thing, right? It's almost up against the timeline. From the beginning, there's two mothers. They're both trying to protect their daughters. Only one of them can succeed, right? That's the premise. So you're like, wow, how is this going to play out? You're almost kind of waiting for the inevitable. And when you set up a premise like that, I've never written a book before, but if I was, I don't know if I would do that. I'd almost be too intimidated to say, 2 go in, 1 goes out. Can you figure it out? So I was curious, as someone who's made people cry and who's made people surprised by the twists, like how do you go about setting up kind of 2 people like that and building up to that payoff, which can be such a daunting thing to try and surprise a reader, especially in this day and age.
I mean, I love it depends what you like, right? Because some people love novels that sort of jump into like, and it's just like really fast pacing from the first page, and you have like just running and exploding and fighting from first page. And I really like to have like a really explosive ending of a book where suddenly all the different threads tie together, and it feels like like an orchestra where it sort of comes to a crescendo, and it's really exciting to write. And when it comes to, this was my first attempt of writing a kind of mystery, but so there's definitely mystery, thrillery, maybe not really mystery elements in a book. And it was quite a challenge, because you have to, when you're building tension in a book, it can't be constant. It can't keep going up. Like, you have to have like little dips so that it doesn't lose its effect. Because when you have this kind of anticipation as a reader, if it is constant, if that tension is constant, it loses its kind of psychological and emotional effect. So you need to sort of ease up a little bit. And that was the sort of biggest challenge in the writing process, but something that I really enjoyed. But it's, yes, I mean, the whole like big part of the book is that one of the characters knows what's going on, and the other one will slowly try and figure it out and piece it together. And the thing about, like, when you're writing mothers who are trying to protect their children, the very useful thing it does, from my perspective as writer, is it instantly justifies most horrible actions in the eyes of the reader. Because, like, even if you're like, like you said, like, you guys are not mothers, but you most likely know what it's like to really deeply care about someone, whether it's a parent, whether it's your partner, whether it's your child, like, you know what it's like to really care about someone. And I think, like, most people have experienced it at least at some point in their lives. And so like, from a reader's perspective, when you see, like, okay, so that's on the line, because we put like those lines, right, like in sand of morality, but it's very relative, but we like to think in absolutes. And we think, like, some things are worth dying for. Like, it's like, when it comes to, justice and honor and being truthful and defending, your country and your thing, like, those things are worth dying for. It's like, but yes, but are they worth sacrificing your child for? That is, those are kind of questions, because obviously, like, why we might not empathize with the character doing anything to protect themselves, the moment they do something truly dreadful in order to protect their child, we take a completely different perspective.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, no, I just think it's really interesting, the idea that you just brought up of, like, oh, wow, we can pretty easily think of ourselves like, oh, it's worth sacrificing your life for blah, blah, whether we do it or not. But we can easily think of that as being worthwhile. But yeah, it's hard to come up with anything that would be worth sacrificing a child for. And it's, it allows you to write these really complex characters because they have those kind of motivations, where it's like you have them doing some really noble things in service of, like, what could be more noble than trying to protect your daughter, trying to find your daughter. I mean, but then you have them doing some very questionable things in service of those goals. And it's like, I guess it's interesting. It's just, you have those complex character elements that make this feel very, like, real and present these moral conundrums in that sense. But you also have this, like, fairy tale feel to the book, which is something I want to get across to the listeners, where it's like, reading this feels like reading a fairy tale. And I mean that in a complimentary way, because I'm like, how do you capture that tone while also having these characters feel so real and complex. And I don't know, how do you find that balance?
I mean, I think my writing style is quite, it can be described as quite lyrical, I suppose. So in
Yeah.
some ways, so um, it's it's just like a natural rhythm for me. But I also think that once you look at the person's motivations and kind of strip away a lot of the nonsense around it, it kind of like the essence of the emotions is the essence of fairy tales. So, you know, when you read most fairy tales, like, you'll notice like characters don't have names, right?
Mm-hmm.
There once was a princess living
Yeah.
in the castle of a good king, you know? Like you have all those, like you kind of trim away the excess, and what's left with is like the heart of a story. And I think this is and this is something I strive for, you know, like in as much as I like writing quite lyrically, I think it's important to find this balance between being economical with words and kind of being evocative at the same time. And I think the way to do it is to kind of really root deep to but why is this character doing it? It's like, you know, why this character is doing it. And like the rest of it is just window dressing, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like a lot of the books, you know, I wanted to go back to some of that, I guess what I would call the modern feel of the book, which is kind of the stakes and the pacing. And you were talking about the motivations and, you know, putting your child over your own life. And one of the things that I found fascinating about it was that you have, you know, like your two main characters, right? They're each trying to protect their daughter, right? So you have both working for the same ends, and they're kind of put against each other in a way sometimes, and sometimes they're together, sometimes they're not. It's one of those aspects where you're like, well, you don't necessarily want one to lose or one to win. Can one even lose or win in this situation? You know, it's this idea that they're both working. They're so, I guess one of these things about motherhood is like putting your kid above everything else. So when that goes up against the will of someone else who's feeling a very similar way, they would do anything for their child too. And then you kind of put them against each other. What happens? And I feel like that's a very strong driving force of the whole book, because you're like, oh, when these two characters like learn these things about each other or learn about something else, like I wonder how they're gonna kind of interact. And I guess it's that sort of like two mothers coming together and how the stakes put side by side could potentially affect the story too. And it's one of those things that you don't read too much about. And, you know, we've read a lot of fantasy this year, and it's one of those unique things. Like usually we kill the mom to give the other characters motivation. And in this case, it was the absolute reverse. So I thought that like this idea of, and I guess I want to get more of a sense of these two characters, right? These two mothers, like where did this kind of relationship come about of like, oh, if I put two mothers with both trying to do what's best for their kids, and kind of the complexity of the relationship that results from that. Like, was that, I guess, kind of
I think
like the big drive for the book?
So the thing is, you know, you can have two people who are pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
And then, you know, if you put them in an extreme situation, the result is unpredictable. You know, like I was talking with my friend, like something I was thinking about a lot when near the end of writing this book actually is the trolley issue. So it's the trolley problem. It's like you're familiar with it? It's
Yes.
So for those sort of listeners who don't know, it's a sort of philosophical conundrum of you're driving a train or a trolley, wherever you're based, down the tracks, and you see ahead of you one person that you love on the tracks, and you can swerve, but then you'll hit like 14 people that you don't know. And what are you going to do? And some people are like, of course, like one life, 14 lives, you would. I've heard people say like, of course, like I would hit the person I love, because how dare, I have no right to kill 14 people. And me and like my friend who's also a mother, we just looked at each other and was like, I would sell everybody in this room for organs if it was to like, if it saved my child's life. Come on. So it's, and I think there is like, we like to sort of often present those, because humans like to live in a simple world. We want to simplify this world, and it resists that. And the truth is that we want those, like, we want to think that there's certain sort of unchanging rules of morality that everybody kind of feels intrinsically, down to their soul, and they would sort of adhere to it, unless there was something wrong with them. And it's very easy to believe that unless you're tested.
Yeah, for certain.
And I think, it's often in the real world, like, in many novels, you have someone who is faced, with dreadful difficulties in order to protect the person they love, right? But, their enemy, it might be protecting someone they love. And I feel like that is often not given as much space in a book, because, and for a good reason, because, as a writer, you want people to empathize with your protagonist, right? And if you show the protagonist killing the baddie who is threatening the protagonist's village, that's fine. But if you see that from the other side, that the protagonist is killing a father of 5 small children who look up to him, like right. that hits differently.
Yeah.
And I think it's important sort of not to lose sight of this. Like, that's why I wanted to sort of show those two perspectives, those two mothers, not to lose, not to sort of get locked into this is the protagonist, and so we will just go along with whatever they do, but to sort of see the humanity of the person on the other side as well.
Yeah. Now, we've talked about before the idea that our heroes often kill a lot of henchmen on the way to oftentimes sparing the villain, which is an interesting...
Yes, someone who was probably like forcibly enlisted, right?
And
their mother is waiting by the door, planting flowers, hoping they'll bloom just in time for her son's return. Right. And her son's been murdered by the protagonist.
Exactly. But we don't get to hear about any of that.
Just to have a knife over the Dark Lord and be like, you know what? I'm going to let you go because I'm such a nice guy.
I'm more interested in that mother.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, we've often kind of entertained the idea of like, what happens if the story just left the hero and followed like the fallout of killing that henchman, and then the life that poor henchman left behind, and all the repercussions of that, is almost as interesting as whatever the hero was going to do to the evil overlord at the end of that book. It's
isn't that brilliant? I mean, that is... like, that's to me far more interesting, because that's the story that isn't told as much.
I agree.
Right?
Sure. And who knows if there's a family at home, if they even understood what was happening, if their daily lives are affected by whatever is going on.
What about the generational trauma? It's all of that is, and I think there's far more people in this world who have their like family stories, like, of the family of the murdered henchman, than they are of like people who witnessed the hero saving the day.
Right.
For sure. The murdered henchman, that's got a nice ring to it. I'd read that. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about outside of the Bone Roots is that you're also a co-host of a YouTube channel, right?
Yes. Oh gosh. Yes, I mean, we did do it's like a mini series of videos.
Sure. Okay.
Bookish take. And with my very good friend Caroline Hardacre, who's a fantastic writer, by the way. Definitely look her up. And I don't know how to describe it. So basically, she ran out of time at some point, so we can't continue because she had 2 babies. It's like, people's private lives are very inconvenient for me. Like, what can I say?
She put her children before your YouTube channel?
I mean, really.
Is that what the book is based on? Someone who would be willing to murder a book
ultimate
channel
betrayal of our
children.
YouTube channel. But it was always meant to be it was always meant to be like a little mini series, and her babies.
So what was it about?
Oh, okay. So it was about basically our road to publication. It was more like basically our advice on searching for agent and how we found our agent and what our different attitude, sort of approach to editing stages. So Caroline, for example, like writes a book and then she rewrites it.
Wow.
So she writes a book,
commitment,
puts it away, writes it from scratch.
Oh, wow.
Which is the kind of level of like that's the kind of level of intellect that I can only aspire to. I think I'm not sure I would be able to do that, but it's really interesting how people's brains work. Like and in itself, I think it's really interesting to talk about because we all only can talk from our own perspective on writing, because it is. Like, I mean, it is art, right? So you can't. It's try to explain to someone how to compose a piece of music. Like, you can try, you can give them the basics, but it's everyone will approach it differently, isn't it? And it's no different to writing. And there's all those books out about how to write novels, and but they don't always show this tiny perspective, and it's important to remain flexible and like understand that you will find your own way.
Yeah, we've talked to quite a few authors at this point, and I think the only thing that is a through line through all of them is that they're different from each other. Like, there's no path to publishing or writing or anything that is just like the way to do it from what I've gathered. And I think, of course, writing advice is helpful because you can find, which of these things can I pick up? Which of these things are going to work for me?
But the industry is changing. It's changing at a pace that is very difficult to predict. And, and sometimes you look at the careers of people who have really big names in the industry who started 20, 30 years ago. And you think, okay, so they start from this, this avenue is closed now, and they went through here. That's not how that industry works anymore,
Right.
And and it could be quite dispiriting, but then there's people who are trying new things all the time now. So it's interesting, but there is it's a very complicated industry. And I think understanding that it's very complicated is a good place to start.
Yeah, I've heard someone like Brandon Sanderson say, like, people ask me, like, how was I able to make it? And he's like, if you want to hear the story, sure, I can tell you. But if you want to use that to try to emulate it, like, that is so outdated from what people are experiencing nowadays, and the entire landscape is different.
Absolutely.
And the likelihood you're going to get tapped on the shoulder to finish Wheel of Time is pretty small as well. But
not a winning strategy these days, I don't think.
Exactly. It's not something you can necessarily emulate, right? But it's I worked in comics publishing for a bit, and I was just sort of seeing how it works now and how it worked 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's very difficult to make a living out of it right now. It really is. It's so underpaid. It's companies keep a very sort of tight hold over over who gets to do what exactly. And I mean, it was like that in some ways. In some ways, it was worse, but people could make a very decent living out of it. And I've met some top artists who barely scrape a living together out of it, and they have to find different avenues, so
Sure.
so it's evolving, and I think it's important to sort of evolve with it.
Absolutely. I mean, like, when you consider back in the day, the only way, even like 20 years ago, the only way to like read a book was to go to a bookstore and buy it. There's a lot an industry can control at that point. It's a lot easier for someone to sell 1 million copies when there's only like 4 big publishers and your local bookstore, Now it's just, you can buy it on any device and read it however you want, and anyone can publish it. So it's just a different
I mean,
landscape.
there's a flip side to that, in that I got this. I was talking to this agent, and he gave me this number. I did not fact check that number, just as a thing.
So we can't cite you also.
So he said that every day on Amazon, 4,000 new fiction titles in English come out.
Wow.
I believe it.
And it's hard to...
Right? Yeah. Most of them self-published, but it is an astounding number. Mm-hmm. And, when my father was telling me, when he was a young man, like sort of, in the 60s, 70s, he could buy and read 100% of books in fantasy and sci-fi genre published every year.
Wow.
Right?
That makes sense.
They were mostly written by white men.
For sure.
Of course.
Of course.
But it was a perfectly manageable number. Like, if you were into a fantasy and sci-fi genre, you could talk to all the other people and, into that genre, and you would have all read the same books. Whereas now, when I compare my reading list to my friends, they barely overlap.
Right.
Which is really interesting in itself, isn't it? Like how fragmented it's become. So there's a lot of good things about it, but it makes it much more difficult for the writers who are published to make a living.
Yeah.
That's true.
How do you become the person of those 4,000 novels who is actually getting in front of people and getting downloaded? It's like, I mean, I admire all the work that folks who self-publish do, because it's hard to find a way to actually get your book to be the one that gets picked up by people, and it's
sure. And there is a difficulty in that. There's a lot of wonderful things that are being published, for self-publishing. And then there's some books that do extremely well. And sometimes those two categories overlap. But it's it's very hard. And there's all those wonderful authors whose extremely original books will not be read by any significant number of people, purely because marketing is really hard. And even and having an Instagram account on its own will not necessarily do anything. It will not convert into sales. So it is a very sort of complex situation, and like figuring it out is going to be the next step, really, isn't it?
For sure, it's always changing, and it can be ultimately, you like to think it will be a good thing, because, like you said, it's giving a lot of people the opportunity to tell a lot of different stories that may not have been possible to publish when you only release 30 books in a year, and it has to be one of 30. Now you're releasing as many as you want, and you can tell these wilder stories. So it's crazy to think, and I feel this sometimes, where I'm like, there's definitely so many books out there that I would read and be absolutely amazed by that I may never discover. And I have that thought all the time. It's kind of crazy. I actively seek books out. You try and pick the best one, and there's just a mountain of perfect books for your reading style out there somewhere that you just have to you may never find.
Yeah, it's really hard, but I'm glad that you picked up the bone roots.
Yes.
Among
Oh,
all
yes.
of those thousands of books.
Right, like somehow we still found a way to connect, and I found a way to survive the Logan Airport, but
I'm glad
true.
I helped with that,
Yeah.
in whatever small way.
Yes,
Because
and
that sounds
4,000.
like a
Oh, for sure, for sure. It ended up working out, but it's one of those things like 4,000 books a day. I think with the Bone Roots, you still manage to tell. To me anyway, as someone who is reading like multiple books a month, is like a very unique story. I appreciate the fast moving of it, almost this like mystery suspense piece to it, the different perspectives, these new voices to these characters that you brought, and the way that they have their relationships with other characters. It was a very fascinating book for me, and I digested it, and that's not an easy experience for me to have these days, as being like someone who just reads fantasy, like, okay, next, to have that experience of just being like kind of letting the book kind of carry you through it. There's definitely that, I call it like suspense, but it's that idea of like you're not putting it down, you're turning, you're going through it. It kind of takes you away for a little bit. So congratulations on that. Congratulations on the release of the Bone Roots, and thank you for the experience. It was really a fantastic read, and we both highly recommend it.
Thank you so much.
Well, Dylan, anything else we would like to ask before we wrap it up?
I think that we ought to ask, where can folks find you, Gabriela? How can folks connect with you, buy your books, of course? Where's the best place to reach out? The interwebs.
Well, they can buy my books in most places they're sold. Hopefully. Definitely the internet. If you can never rely on like a particular bookshop to stock your books, but you can always get them online. If the American audience is interested in the middle grade, the children's books that I wrote, The Wind Child, then they're available for Blackwell's in the UK, and they ship them to US at no cost.
Nice.
So I only found this out recently, so I recommend it because you can buy UK only books.
Interesting.
Without any shipping costs, which is nice. I have a website, GabrielaHouston.com, and if someone wants to sort of contact me, then I have a contact page. I'm on Twitter as well, at Gabriela Houston, which is very easy. And Instagram at Gabriela Houston 1, because I lost my login details to at Gabriela Houston. At Gabriela Houston 1 now.
We thought you
I own
like
both accounts.
So we have kind of the opposite. We have at the FTF podcast on Instagram. We ended up with at the FTF podcast 1 on Twitter. So we have the reverse. Although our thing, someone stole the at the FTF podcast.
Well, they, rightfully were the first to claim it. They just don't do anything with it.
Yeah. Waste. Right.
Yeah. But, we've embraced the one now. It's part of what you got to do.
And
I actually
you've embraced
because you're number one. Yeah.
Exactly
Yes.
right. Twitter, anyway, whatever that's worth these days. But I actually did think of another question, Gabriela. Like, the Bone Roots is coming out October 10th. So everyone's got to get their pre-orders in, make sure they get that and read that. But I'm sure when they finish that, the question will be, what's next? Are you working on anything? Is there any idea that interests you? I know it's a daunting question to ask me. Literally, it's like, let me publish the book first, please. But, as someone now who's read it for a while now, I'm like, what's next here, right? Like, what stories are we going to work on next?
I am so I have so I'm working on a book that is like completely different right now. So it's a bit of a kind of more towards a thriller side.
Oh.
And it's contemporary. So we'll see where that takes me. And I also am involved in like a little secret project. So hopefully I'll be able to announce at some point. We'll see.
Sounds like we better
it's very
go
early
to GabrielaHouston.com and check that regularly just to make sure we don't miss it. because that
Sign
sounds
up
very
to my
exciting.
newsletter. I have not actually sent a single newsletter out yet. Maybe I shouldn't be maybe I did it out. Maybe I shouldn't be admitting to it. But you can sign up to my newsletter. I won't spam you.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. You
But
may
when
never
I
get
actually
anything. That's
have
part of the excitement.
something very important to announce,
Ooh.
you'll be, among the first to know.
You'll want to know for sure. Well, that's exciting to hear. I'm excited for the thriller. I can kind of see that with the Bone Roots. I'd be like, this is someone who I would read a thriller novel from for sure. So that's very exciting. Can't wait to see
Watch his
what
face.
others. Yeah, exactly. Can't wait to see what other secret projects you'll be able to share in the near future. Looking forward to that as well.
Well,
all right.
You follow me on Twitter, so that's a good start.
Yes. We'll get there. We're the one with the number 1 at the end of the handle, just so you don't follow the wrong.
Not like the pretenders, no.
Yeah. Don't engage
Charles
with
is
those
showing
guys.
he never goes on social media. We mutually follow each other, Charles. It's already happened.
Yeah, I know, but what I'm saying is don't follow the other person without. You got to look for the one at the end.
I thought you followed the people who stole your handle.
Right. But if they try and reach out, you just ignore them. Block them or something.
They're imposters.
They're imposters.
X.
Yeah, exactly. X.
Oh, X. Yes.
So.
Yeah. So.
Go ahead, Dylan.
I was to make a statement.
You're just trying to seg out of here, yeah. So, that's it. Gabriela, thank you so much for your time. I know it's late across the pond over where you are. So thank you for making the time to record with us today. I'm gonna say it one more time: the Bone Roots, October 10th. Don't miss out, guys. Definitely want to check that out. Thank you all so much for listening. Have a great day, and as always, guys, go forth and conquer, friends. That's our outro. Bye.